The morning Major Sarah Chen's fighter jet was reported missing. The sky over Fort Mercer Air Base was the kind of blue that made people stop and stare. It was November, and the Oklahoma wind carried that particular cold that cuts through you when you're not paying attention. Commander James Patterson stood in the operations tower, watching the runway below. He was thinking about his morning coffee when the radio crackled with words that would change everything. "We've lost contact with Angel 7, the voice said. Calm, professional, everything a military person is trained to be in a crisis. Sarah's A-10 Thunderbolt, call sign Angel 7, had been on a training mission over the Red River Ranges. It was supposed to be routine. It always was supposed to be routine. Sarah had been stationed at Fort Mercer for 18 months, long enough to know everyone's name, not long enough for most of them to know hers. She'd grown up in a small suburb of Tulsa called Redstone, a place where nothing much happened except high school football and church on Sundays. Her father had been a mechanic, her mother a nurse. Neither had military experience. Sarah had joined the Air Force at 22, right out of college, with a degree in aeronautical engineering and a determination that made people uncomfortable, not because she was mean about it. She was kind, actually, almost too kind. But she wanted something they could feel, even if they couldn't name it. The problem was that Major Sarah Chen didn't fit the image that most of the men at Fort Mercer had in their heads about fighter pilots. She was 5'4". She didn't yell much. She wasn't from a military family. And she was a woman in a field where, despite all the laws and policies, the culture of men still ran deep as roots. Sergeant Marcus Webb was one of the few who'd bothered to get to know her. He worked maintenance on the A-10s, and he'd watched Sarah do her pre-flight checks with more attention to detail than pilots twice her rank showed. One afternoon, about 6 months after she arrived, he'd asked her why. "Because if I miss something," she'd said, not looking up from the inspection checklist, "I die. And more importantly, the person I'm working with dies, and maybe the people on the ground die too." Marcus had understood right then that this woman took things seriously in a way that mattered. But most of the pilots didn't think about her much at all. She was just the lady pilot, the one who'd gotten the assignment because of diversity programs. That's what Colonel Hansen had basically said in the break room once, loud enough for everyone to hear but not directly to her. "Recruitment quotas," he'd called it, followed by a laugh that landed hard. Sarah had heard it, she always heard it, but she never said anything. Major David Hutchins, though, he was different. He was kind to her in the way that important men are kind to people they see as beneath them, gentle, encouraging. He'd taken her under his wing, shown her the ropes, told her she was doing great. Everyone liked David. He had the right look, the right background, the right kind of confidence. When he smiled, people believed in him. "You're doing fine," he'd told her once, standing next to his F-16. "Don't let the guys get to you, they're just protective of the club." She'd wanted to believe that. She'd wanted to believe there was something protecting about the way they'd watched her, the way they'd graded her performance more harshly, the way they'd whispered just loud enough for her to hear. But Sarah had learned young that wanting to believe something and believing it were different things. The search and rescue teams were dispatched immediately. That's standard protocol. You send the helicopters, the planes, the ground teams. You search for 48 hours hard, then you adjust expectations. That's the military way. They found the crash site after 6 hours. The A-10 was down in a canyon 20 miles south of the designated training area. It had gone down hard. The fuselage was torn open, scattered across rocks and scrub brush. There was no way anyone could have walked away from that impact. Commander Patterson was the one who found Sarah's mother. She was in the small town of Redstone, in the house where she'd raised a daughter she'd believed would change the world. Sarah's mother, Linda Chen, had held the door open in her bathrobe, and she'd known before Patterson said a word. Mothers know. There's something in a uniformed officer's face when they're carrying that particular kind of grief. "We're very sorry," Patterson had said. The words he'd said 100 times before, the words that never meant anything because no words ever could. Sarah's mother had nodded, and then she'd sat down on the couch in her living room, and she hadn't gotten up for 3 days. The official cause of the crash was listed as pilot error, a stall. Sarah had supposedly misjudged her altitude or her angle, and the plane had dropped out of the sky. It happened sometimes, not often, but sometimes. Young pilots with more confidence than skill. That's what the preliminary report suggested. Sarah Chen was marked KIA, killed in action. They had a small ceremony at the base. A lot of the pilots showed up. They talked about how tragic it was, how young she was. David Hutchins gave a speech. He talked about Sarah's dedication, her commitment to the mission. He didn't mention that she'd never been given a real mission. He didn't mention that she'd been flying training runs over and over while he got the important assignments. Marcus Webb stood at the back of the ceremony. He didn't cry. Maintenance men don't cry at military funerals. But he thought about Sarah's meticulous pre-flight checks, and he thought about a woman who understood that missing something could cost lives. Then he went back to work, because that's what you do. The preliminary investigation was closed after 3 weeks. The final report would come later, but the conclusion was already written. Pilot error, a tragic loss, a reminder of the dangers of combat aviation training. No one asked very many questions after that. In Redstone, Sarah's mother began the long work of grieving a daughter who would have changed the world. She sat in her living room and looked at pictures. Her friends came by with casseroles and soft words. She wore black to church. And every morning she asked herself the same question. Why didn't she believe in herself more? Why hadn't she told Sarah how proud she was? It was a cold that wouldn't lift, even after winter turned to spring. But about 300 miles north, in the mountains of Colorado, something very different was happening. Sarah had survived, not how anyone would have predicted, not in any way that the investigation would ever have found, but she had survived. And that survival was going to change everything. Her eyes opened to a white ceiling, and for a moment, maybe a full minute, she couldn't remember anything. Not her name, not how she'd gotten there, not who she was. There was just the pain, a deep bone-level ache that made her want to cry out. But she didn't. Something in her training, some voice in her head, told her not to make noise. Later, she would piece together what happened. The A-10 hadn't malfunctioned. That much became clear as her mind began working again. She'd been flying routine checks when someone on the radio gave her the wrong coordinates. She'd adjusted course, dropping altitude to get a better visual on where she was supposed to be. That's when the SAM missile hit her. Surface-to-air missile. Not supposed to be there. Not supposed to be anywhere near a training flight over domestic airspace. Someone had made a mistake, or someone hadn't. The A-10 was designed to take punishment. The plane's structure wrapped around the pilot's cockpit like armor. The engines were mounted high enough that they were harder to hit. But a SAM at close range didn't care how tough you were. The explosion had torn through the right side of the aircraft, and Sarah had ejected by instinct. She'd floated down in her parachute, watching her $10 million plane burn itself into scraps on the rocks below. She'd landed hard on a boulder in the canyon. She'd thought something was broken, probably something was. Her left leg had screamed when she moved it. Her right arm had felt wrong. But she was alive and she was conscious, and the most important rule of survival is this: do the next thing. She'd started walking. There was a road about 3 miles away, but she didn't know that yet. She just walked in what seemed like the right direction. It had been afternoon when she ejected. It was dark by the time she reached the rural highway. It was midnight by the time an old pickup truck, a red Ford that had seen better years, came around the curve and nearly hit her as she stood in the road, still in her flight suit, blood on her collar. The man driving had been named Dale Pearson. He was 73 years old, a retired geologist who lived alone in the Colorado mountains. He'd been coming back from a late dinner in town, and he'd almost driven past a ghost. "Jesus," he'd said, putting on the brakes. Sarah had gotten in the truck. She shouldn't have, of course. A woman alone with a strange man in the middle of nowhere is a fairy tale that doesn't end well. But Sarah was trained to assess threats, and this old man in his worn Carhartt jacket didn't register as a threat. And more than that, her arm felt like it might fall off, and she was pretty sure her leg was broken. "I need a hospital," she'd said. But Dale had taken one look at her face and made a different decision. "You a pilot?" he'd asked. He'd seen the insignia on her flight suit. "Yes," she'd said. "Military?" "Yes." Dale had nodded, and then he'd driven past the highway that led to the hospital and headed toward the mountains instead. He'd lived alone for 15 years since his wife died. He'd kept himself busy, reading, hiking, listening to audiobooks. He'd become the kind of man who questioned things. "You run into trouble?" he'd asked. Sarah hadn't answered. She couldn't. If she told him what she knew, she'd be putting him in danger. Better to lie. Better to say it was a mechanical failure, an emergency landing, something that sounded routine. But Dale had been a geologist. He'd been trained to look at evidence and read stories written in stone. He looked at Sarah's flight suit and saw scorch marks that didn't match a mechanical failure. He'd let it go. His house was small, off a private road, surrounded by ponderosa pines that had stood for 100 years. He'd helped her inside, gotten her on his couch, and then he'd done something that surprised them both. He'd treated her injuries with a confidence that made it clear he'd done this kind of thing before. "You know field medicine?" she'd asked. "I've been a lot of places in my life," he'd said, "picked up skills." He'd set her leg, she'd cried out despite herself, and wrapped it with expert hands. Her arm was badly bruised but not broken. It was her head that concerned him. She had a concussion, maybe two. She couldn't remember things clearly. Her vision went blurry sometimes. "You need a hospital," he'd said, not for the first time. "I can't," she'd said. "Why not?" "Because if I go to a hospital, they're going to ask questions, and the answers to those questions are going to get me killed." Dale had looked at her for a long moment, then he'd nodded. "Okay," he'd said, "then you stay here, we'll figure it out." The first week was the worst. Sarah ran a fever. Her dreams were full of blood and fire and the sound of engines. She woke up screaming sometimes, and Dale would come in and sit by her bed until she fell asleep again. He didn't talk much. He just sat there, and his presence was enough. By the second week, she could get to the bathroom without his help. By the third week, she could walk to the kitchen. "What's your name?" he'd asked her that morning, handing her coffee. "Sarah," she'd said, "Sarah Chen." "Dale Pearson." They'd shaken hands like they were meeting at a church social, instead of a man harboring a fighter pilot who was supposed to be dead. "What happens now?" Dale had asked. Sarah had been thinking about that constantly. The crash would have been investigated. They would have found the wreckage of her plane. They would have concluded she'd died in the impact. They would have sent her mother a flag. There would have been a memorial service. She was dead, that was the easiest explanation. Pilot error, tragic loss, case closed. But Sarah had information that someone didn't want her to have. Someone had fired a SAM missile in American airspace at her plane. Someone had wanted her dead, and if she showed up alive, they'd finish the job. "I need to figure out who did this," she'd said. "And then what?" Dale had asked. "And then I need to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Dale had nodded slowly. He'd seen enough of the world to know that sometimes the right thing to do was also the dangerous thing. "You'll need help," he'd said. "I can't involve you in this." "Already am," he'd said. "Question is whether you're going to turn down the help or be smart enough to take it." Sarah had laughed then. It was the first time since the crash. "Who are you?" she'd asked. "Like I said," Dale replied, "I've been a lot of places in my life." Over the next 2 months, Sarah began piecing together a picture. She had Dale's laptop. She had a satellite phone she'd taken from the crash site as part of her emergency gear. She began making calls, careful calls to people she trusted in the military. One of them was Sergeant Marcus Webb. "I can't tell you where I am," she'd told him, her voice tight with tension. "But I need to know something, my crash. Did anything seem wrong about it?" Marcus had gone silent. "Yeah," he'd said finally. "Yeah, something seemed wrong. The investigation closed too fast, and I looked at the wreckage. There was no way that was just pilot error." "Is there anything in the maintenance logs? Anything that seemed off before I flew?" Marcus had checked. What he'd found had made his blood run cold. The day before Sarah's flight, someone had accessed her aircraft's files. Someone had looked at her flight plan. Someone had known exactly where she was going to be. "Who has access to those files?" Sarah had asked. Marcus had thought about it. High-level pilots, officers, command staff. "Who specifically knew my flight plan?" There had been a pause, then Marcus had said a name. "David Hutchins. He reviewed all flight plans for training missions." Sarah's hands had shaken as she held the phone. David, the man who'd been kind to her, the man who'd taken her under his wing. She'd trusted him. "There's something else," Marcus had said. "Sarah, you need to know this. The investigation report, it blames you. It says you were flying outside your skill level. It's going to damage your service record. Officially, you're a reckless pilot who killed herself." That night, Sarah had sat on Dale's porch, looking at the mountains, and she'd understood something fundamental about the world. Sometimes the people who smile at you with kindness are the ones who want you dead. But she was alive, and now she knew who to look for. The question was, what was she going to do about it? 3 months after the crash, David Hutchins was living his best life. He'd gotten the promotion Sarah had been hopping for. He was the new commander of training operations, which meant he had authority over flight assignments, safety protocols, and most importantly, the investigation records. He'd successfully become the keeper of his own secrets. At Fort Mercer, people were starting to forget about Sarah Chen. There had been a memorial, a moment of silence. A few sad stories told over coffee, but memory is a river and tragedy is a stone in it. The river keeps flowing. David had even started dating again. He'd set his sights on Jennifer Mills, who worked in communications. She had a nice laugh and the kind of conventional beauty that felt safe. He'd asked her to dinner, and she'd said yes, and for a moment, David Hutchins had felt like maybe he could close the door on the guilt and move forward. But Sarah wasn't interested in letting him move forward. She'd spent 3 months gathering evidence. Marcus had been careful about it, pulling information from different files, never accessing anything in a way that would trigger alerts. Dale had used his old connections. He'd been more than a simple geologist, it turned out. He'd worked for a contractor that did sensitive government work for decades to access satellite records from the day of the crash. There it was, clear as day. A military drone flying in the region where Sarah's plane had gone down. Not an American drone, a contractor-operated drone. The kind that existed in the gray space between legal and not legal. Someone had fired a missile from that drone. Someone had wanted Sarah dead. The only question was why, and what they thought Sarah knew or had seen or was. Sarah had spent her months in the mountains thinking about this. She'd thought about her last few weeks before the crash. She'd thought about conversations she'd overheard. There had been something about a training exercise that wasn't quite training, something about a shipment that had come through the base. Then she'd remembered. There had been a morning brief about contract work on the base. New equipment, new procedures. She'd only half listened because it wasn't her area of concern. But David had listened very carefully. And later, she'd seen him talking to a man who didn't work on base. A civilian, serious-looking, the kind of guy who looked like he did contract work for whoever paid best. Sarah thought she knew what had happened. She thought David had gotten involved in something he shouldn't have. Something that made money, something involving the military. And she thought Sarah had seen something or might see something that would ruin it. A simple solution: remove Sarah from the equation. Getting back to Fort Mercer wasn't a simple process. Sarah couldn't just walk through the gates. She was dead. She had no official identity anymore. But Sarah had spent 3 months getting herself back into fighting shape. The leg was healed. The arm was strong again. She'd trained like she was preparing for war. Which, in a way, she was. Dale had helped her get to the base. He had old connections, people who owed him favors, people who could help a disappeared woman move through the world with a new name. By April, Sarah had new documents, a new identity, a new look. She'd cut her hair short and dyed it blonde. She'd lost weight. She wore glasses. To anyone who looked at her, she was no one they'd ever seen before. But she was still Sarah Chen, and Sarah Chen had never left anything unfinished. She got a job at Fort Mercer through a temp agency. She worked in administration. It gave her access to buildings, computers, records. For 3 weeks, she worked quietly, filing documents, answering phones, becoming the kind of invisible employee that no one remembers. And she waited. She waited for a moment when David was alone. She waited for an opportunity. It came on a Tuesday afternoon. David was working late in his office. Sarah had watched his schedule. She knew he stayed late on Tuesdays, usually after everyone else had left. She knew his routine had become almost meditative in its predictability. She walked into his office without knocking. David looked up from his computer, irritated. Then he looked closer. Then his face went white. "You're dead," he said. "No," Sarah said, closing the door behind her. "I'm not." David's hand moved toward the phone, but Sarah pulled a gun. She'd gotten it from Dale through his connections. She wasn't trained in weapons, that wasn't her specialty, but she could point and pull a trigger, and that was enough. "Don't," she said. David's hands went up. "Sarah, I don't know what you think you know, but—" "I know you fired a SAM missile at my plane," Sarah said. Her voice was steady. "I know you were trying to kill me, and I know why." David's face twisted. For a moment, she saw the real David Hutchins underneath the kind smile and the confidence. She saw a man who had decided that money was worth a life. She saw it clearly. "It wasn't personal," David said. "That's supposed to make it better. It was business. There was money involved, equipment moving through the base. Someone needed problems solved. You weren't supposed to know anything about it. You were never supposed to know. But I did. Yes, you did, and so someone had to make sure you didn't talk about it. Sarah felt something hard in her chest. She'd known this intellectually, but hearing it said out loud, hearing David say it so calmly, so simply, made her understand the real depths of it. "Who gave the order?" she asked. "I can't tell you that." "Yes," Sarah said, "you can." And then the door to the office opened, and Sarah realized she'd made a mistake. She'd been so focused on David that she hadn't checked the hallway. She hadn't verified that they were alone. Basic military protocol, and she'd abandoned it. Colonel Hanson walked in, the man who'd talked about quota hearing, the man who'd been loudest about Sarah not belonging. He had a gun too, and he was pointing it at her. "Major Chen," he said, and his voice was almost congratulatory. "You're harder to kill than we thought." In that second, Sarah understood something new. This went higher. This wasn't just David. This was command structure. This was corruption that ran deep. "Sir," she said, trying to keep her voice calm, "I can't let this continue." "You can't do anything," Hanson said. "You're dead. You died 3 months ago in a plane crash caused by pilot error. There's no version of this story where you come out alive." He raised the gun. And then Marcus Webb burst through the window. He'd been waiting outside, watching. He'd brought backup, Air Force security, and they'd been monitoring Sarah's comm device, ready to move the moment anything went wrong. What followed happened so fast that afterward, Sarah couldn't quite remember the sequence. Hanson went down. His gun fell. David tried to run for the door and was tackled by a security officer. There was shouting, lots of shouting. And then there was silence. Hanson was unconscious, bleeding from where Marcus had tackled him through the window. David was in handcuffs, and Sarah was standing in an office in Fort Mercer with a gun in her hand, alive. "You took your damn time," she said to Marcus. "Sorry, ma'am," Marcus said, grinning despite himself. "I was trying to be subtle." "That wasn't subtle." "No," Marcus agreed, "but it got the job done." They took David and Hanson to the detention facility on the base. They took the evidence Sarah had gathered, the satellite records, the drone records, the financial trails. They took it all, and they filed it with the Office of Special Investigations. Within 24 hours, the Air Force had launched a formal investigation. Within a week, 3 other officers had been arrested for their involvement in the scheme. Equipment had been going missing from Fort Mercer for months. High-value military tech, sold to contractors who sold it to people nobody wanted to think about. It was bigger than Sarah had thought. It was a network that went beyond David and Hanson, but it started with them. And it started with a pilot everyone had written off. "What happens to me now?" Sarah asked Marcus as they sat in a secure room debriefing with investigators. "Now," Marcus said, "we unring the bell, we get you officially alive again, we get your name cleared, and then we figure out what comes next." "What comes next?" Sarah asked. "Justice," Marcus said simply. "True justice, the kind that matters." Sarah nodded. She'd been dead. Now she was alive. The process of coming back to life turned out to be more complicated than Sarah had expected. In the military, there are procedures for everything, and apparently there are procedures for when someone you've buried turns out to be alive. Papers had to be filed. Her death record had to be reversed. Her mother had to be informed. That was the hard part. Sarah's mother, Linda Chen, received a call on a Tuesday afternoon. The officer on the phone said, "Ma'am, I have news about your daughter." For a moment, just a moment, Linda thought it was another kind of notification, another box of medals, another memory they were dredging up. Then the officer said, "She's alive." Linda had to sit down. She had to sit down right there on the kitchen floor, and she had to breathe very carefully. For 3 months, she'd believed her daughter was dead. She'd grieved her. She'd said goodbye. She'd started the slow work of learning to live with an empty space in her life. And now that space was going to be filled. When Sarah walked into her mother's house in Redstone 3 days later, Linda didn't recognize her at first. Sarah had lost weight. She had cuts on her hands from working with tools, scars on her face from the impact. She looked like a soldier, not the girl who'd gone to college and wanted to change the world. "Mom," Sarah said. And then Linda understood. She understood by the voice, by the way Sarah stood, by something essential and unchangeable in the way her daughter carried herself. Linda crossed the kitchen, and she pulled Sarah into a hug so tight that Sarah felt her ribs ache. "I thought you were dead," Linda said into Sarah's shoulder. "I thought I was too," Sarah said. They sat in the kitchen for hours. Sarah told her mother everything, not the official version that came later in depositions and reports. She told her mother the truth. The missile, the crash, months in the mountains, the investigation, the confrontation with David and Hanson, all of it. Linda listened. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, and her hand never left Sarah's. "I'm so proud of you," she said when Sarah finished. "I'm so proud of you." "Mom." "I need you to hear that," Linda said. "I need you to understand. From the moment you were born, I was proud of you. I was proud when you joined the Air Force. I was proud when people doubted you. I was proud when they said you were the reason and not your own skill. And I was proud when I thought you were dead because I knew you would have done the right thing. I knew that. But I need you to know that I'm proud you survived. I'm proud you came back. I'm proud you found the people who hurt you, and you held them accountable." Sarah had been the strong one through all of this. The soldier, the professional. But hearing her mother say that, hearing someone who loved her unconditionally say that she mattered, broke something open. She cried. It wasn't the kind of crying she'd been trained to suppress. It wasn't the kind you apologize for. It was the kind that comes from a deep place and leaves you lighter when it's done. Linda held her daughter, and they cried together in the kitchen of a house in a small Oklahoma town. The next morning, the news broke. A major investigation into military corruption, 4 officers charged, equipment smuggling, evidence of fraud, and at the center of it, a pilot everyone thought was dead who'd come back to expose the truth. The media descended on Redstone like locusts. News vans, reporters, cameras. Sarah didn't talk to them. Her lawyer advised against it, but her mother did. Linda stood on her front porch, in front of God and the news cameras of Oklahoma, and she told them about her daughter. She told them Sarah was strong. She told them Sarah believed in doing the right thing even when it cost her. She told them that Sarah had been underestimated and dismissed, and that's exactly what her enemies had counted on. They thought she was weak, Linda said, and her voice carried. They thought because she was a woman and she was quiet and she didn't fit their idea of what a fighter pilot should be that she wouldn't matter, that she wouldn't survive, that she wouldn't come back. Linda's eyes were hard as stone. They were wrong about every single thing. That soundbite made national news. By the next morning, Sarah Chen's story was everywhere. A young woman pilot in the Air Force, marked as KIA, victim of a conspiracy, survivor, seeker of truth. The narrative that had been written for her, careless pilot, tragic mistake, was replaced with a new narrative. Hero, soldier, person who mattered. But Sarah felt the weight of all that attention. She didn't want to be famous. She wanted to go back to flying. She wanted to do her job. She wanted to prove that she belonged there, not because she was brave enough to expose corruption, but because she was good at what she did. 2 weeks after coming back to Redstone, Sarah returned to Fort Mercer. The base was different. People looked at her differently. Some looked away. Some looked at her with admiration. Some looked like they were reassessing everything they'd thought about her. "Welcome back, Major," the gate guard said, and she heard the respect in his voice. Marcus was waiting for her in the briefing room. "You ready for this?" he asked. "For what?" Sarah asked. "For them to see you as you are instead of how they imagined you." Sarah thought about that. "I don't know if that's possible," she said. "Maybe not," Marcus said, "but we can try." The Air Force had started an official investigation into Sarah's accident. Evidence had been reviewed. Procedures had been questioned. The preliminary report that blamed pilot error had been withdrawn. The new report was still being compiled, but it would exonerate her completely. More importantly, her next assignment had already been approved. She was going to train new pilots. She was going to teach them everything she knew about precision flying, about survival, about maintaining focus when the world is trying to make you doubt yourself. The first class she taught, she stood in front of a room full of young pilots, including 2 young women, and she talked about pressure. She talked about the way people project their own doubts onto you. She talked about not accepting anyone's version of your limitations but your own. "They told me I didn't belong here," Sarah said, not mentioning names, not making it about her own story. "They were polite about it, some of them, but they told me through words and through silence that I wasn't the right kind of person for this job. And I had a choice. I could believe them or I could believe myself." She paused. I believed myself, and it saved my life. After class, one of the young women came up to her. She was nervous. Major Chen, she said, I just wanted to thank you for being here, for showing us. What? Sarah asked, not unkindly. That it's possible, the young woman said. That we can be here and we can matter, and no one can take that from us just because we don't fit their idea of what we're supposed to be. Sarah put a hand on the young woman's shoulder. It is possible, she said, but it's not easy, and the world isn't going to make it easy. You need to know that. But if you're willing to do the hard things, if you're willing to keep doing the right thing even when no one's watching, even when no one believes in you, then it's possible. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment on the base and opened her laptop. She had correspondence from all over the country, messages from women in the military, women who'd felt dismissed, women who'd wondered if they belonged, all of them saying the same thing: thank you for showing us we're not alone. Sarah thought about Dale. She'd invited him to visit, but he'd declined. He'd said he wasn't a parade kind of person, but he'd called her once late at night. I'm proud of you, he'd said. For what? Sarah had asked. For living, Dale had said. For not giving up, for coming back. That's not something everyone can do. Most people would have stayed hidden. You came back and faced it. I had to, Sarah had said. No, Dale had said. That's where you're wrong. You had a choice. You could have disappeared. You could have started a new life. But you came back because it was right, not because it was easy. That's courage, Sarah. After that conversation, Sarah had cried again, not the breaking open kind of tears, the kind of tears that feel like rain on a dry land, the kind that heal instead of wound. She was alive, she was home, and the people who'd tried to destroy her were facing justice. But the story wasn't quite finished. There was one more part to the ending. One more piece of the puzzle that Sarah had to complete. The trial was scheduled for June. 3 officers facing charges. David Hutchins, the primary defendant, Colonel Hanson, who'd pulled the trigger on the cover-up, Major James Weatherby, who'd authorized the contract and signed off on the equipment transfers. Sarah wasn't required to testify. The evidence was strong enough without her, but she wanted to be there. She wanted to see the people who'd tried to erase her face the consequences of what they'd done. The courthouse in Oklahoma City was a modern building, glass and steel, the kind of place that was supposed to be neutral ground. But nothing is neutral when your life is being decided. David Hutchins looked different in a suit without insignia. He looked smaller, less confident. He looked like the kind of man who'd made bad decisions and was finally understanding what that meant. The prosecution was thorough. They presented satellite evidence. They presented financial records showing money moving from contractors to accounts in David's name. They presented testimony from Marcus Webb about the access to the flight plan. They presented Sarah's own evidence, carefully gathered in secret during her months of hiding. The defense argued entrapment. They argued that Sarah had gotten the evidence illegally. They argued that as a deceased person, she had no standing to file reports. The judge overruled that last argument with a look that suggested he found it distasteful. When it came time for Sarah to testify, she was calm. She'd been calm in the wreckage. She'd been calm in the mountains. She'd be calm here too. She took the stand and told the truth. She described the crash. She described waking up in Dale's house. She described the investigation. She described the moment David had admitted he'd tried to kill her. The defense attorney tried to make her out to be a liar, tried to suggest she'd fabricated the evidence, tried to plant seeds of doubt. Sarah just answered his questions with simple facts. She didn't get angry. She didn't get defensive. She was patient, like someone explaining something simple to someone who was pretending not to understand. You're not concerned, the defense attorney said, that your evidence was obtained illegally. I'm concerned about the truth, Sarah said. That's what I'm concerned about. But you understood it was illegal to access military systems. I understood that someone had tried to kill me, Sarah said, and that the people who were supposed to investigate that were the people who'd done it. I understood that I couldn't go to command. I understood that the normal channels had been corrupted, so I did what I had to do to survive. Did you now? The attorney said, but he was losing the room. The jury didn't like what they were seeing. They didn't like a young woman soldier who'd been dismissed and doubted, who'd survived, who'd come back and found the truth. It took the jury 3 days to reach a verdict. Guilty on all counts. David Hutchins was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Colonel Hansen was sentenced to 20 years. Major Weatherby took a plea deal and received 15 years, with the possibility of a reduced sentence if he testified regarding higher-level corruption. As it turned out, there was higher-level corruption. That investigation took months, but eventually, 3 civilians were charged. Government contractors. Men who'd been making money off military equipment and selling it to people in parts of the world where America wanted to pretend they didn't have interests. It was bigger and dirtier than anyone had initially understood. And it was all uncovered because one pilot refused to stay dead. The Air Force held a ceremony for Sarah 2 months after the trial. It was held on the runway at Fort Mercer, in the spot where she'd taken off 3 months before her crash. The day was clear and blue, and the sun was bright on the tarmac. They gave her a medal. It was the kind that gets hung around your neck, and they used the official language about bravery and integrity and upholding the values of the United States military. But what Sarah heard underneath all that was something simpler. We were wrong. We were wrong about you. We're sorry. Her mother was there. Marcus was there. Dale, who decided that being part of the parade for this particular celebration was worth it. And there were young women pilots, cadets, and officers who'd come because they wanted to witness something. They wanted to witness the moment when the world admitted it had been wrong. Sarah's commanding officer was a new colonel, someone brought in after the purge of the base's leadership. He stood at the podium and talked about the importance of integrity. He talked about the courage it took to stand alone against power. He talked about the future of the Air Force being built on trust and truth. Then he stood aside, and Sarah stepped to the podium. "Thank you," she said. "I accept this medal and I'm grateful for the acknowledgement, but I want to say something and I want you to hear it because I think it matters." She looked out at the crowd. Pilots, officers, enlisted personnel, her mother, the young women who'd come to watch. "I was dismissed," Sarah said. "Not by everyone, but by enough people that it mattered. I was told quietly that I didn't belong here, that I wasn't the right kind of person for this job, that I was here because of programs, not because I had earned it." She paused. "And I believed them. I want you to know that. I believed them for a long time. I believed that they were right, that I didn't belong, that I wasn't good enough." Sarah's voice got quieter, but it carried farther. "Then something happened that forced me to believe in myself, and when I did, I was unbreakable. I was fired on with a missile and I survived. I was abandoned by command and I found my own way back. I was marked as dead and I came back alive, and I brought the truth with me." She looked directly at the young women in the crowd. "So here's what I'm telling you. Don't wait for something terrible to happen to believe in yourself. Don't wait for a crisis to know that you're worthy. You're worthy right now. You belong here right now. And no one's doubt, not mine, not your commanding officers, not the world's, can take that from you unless you let it." She stepped back from the podium. There was applause, a lot of applause, more than she'd expected. That night, Sarah sat in the apartment with her mother and Dale and Marcus. They ordered pizza and drank beer and talked about nothing particular. Just the comfortable talk of people who'd been through something hard together and come out on the other side. "What's next?" Dale asked. "Are you staying in the Air Force?" Sarah thought about it. "Yeah," she said. "I think I am. There's more I want to do, more I want to teach, more pilots I want to train. I'm good at this. And now people know it." "You ever going to fly again?" Marcus asked. Sarah smiled. "I've got a few pilot hours I'm working toward. I don't know if they'll let me back in a combat role right now, but I'm certified to fly again and I intend to use that." "An A-10?" Dale asked. "An A-10," Sarah confirmed. "The plane that almost killed me and the plane that saved my life. I think I've got unfinished business with that aircraft." 2 weeks later, Sarah was back in the cockpit of a Thunderbolt. It was a test flight, not a combat mission. Just a chance to see how she felt, how her body responded, how the plane and the pilot fit together. She taxied down the runway, she got clearance, she pushed the throttle forward. The engines roared. The plane accelerated. For a moment, it was touch and go, that magical moment where the aircraft isn't sure if it's going to fly or if it's going to stay on the earth. Then the wheels left the ground, and Sarah Chen, dead and risen, climbed into the sky. She didn't do anything fancy. She didn't loop or roll. She just flew straight and level, feeling the plane's weight and power, understanding the trust that had to exist between a pilot and the machine they were commanding. Below her, the ground fell away. The base got smaller. The horizon opened up. "Angel 7 is good to go," she said into the radio. "Ready for whatever comes next." "Copy that, Angel 7, the controller said. "Welcome back." And Sarah Chen, who'd been marked KIA 3 months ago, who'd died and come back, who'd faced her fears and the people who'd tried to destroy her, who'd chosen truth over comfort, climbed higher into the blue Oklahoma sky. She had unfinished business with the world, and she was ready to finish it. 6 months after her test flight, Major Sarah Chen was flying combat missions. They'd been cautious about it. The military has procedures for trauma, for physical recovery, for psychological evaluation. Sarah had been through all of them. She talked to therapists who wanted to make sure she could handle the memory of the missile, the memory of the crash, the memory of the months in the mountains waiting for revenge. What those therapists discovered was that Sarah had already done the healing, not in the traditional sense, not in the way that therapy works, but in the way that facing the worst part of yourself and the worst part of the world and surviving both of them can heal you. She was ready. Her first combat mission was over a known terrorist stronghold in the Middle East. It was standard work for an A-10 pilot. She was flying close air support for ground troops. They had solid intelligence on the target. It was a straightforward mission. Sarah had done straightforward before, but straightforward was different now. She wasn't flying to prove something. She wasn't flying because she thought she had to be better than everyone else. She was flying because that's what a soldier does. That's what she trained for. That's who she was. The flight over was quiet. Marcus had arranged to be in the command center that day, even though he wasn't officially part of the briefing team. He wanted to be there. He wanted to know Sarah was okay. She was. "Angel 7 is in position," Sarah said as the base came into view. "Copy, Angel 7. You're clear for the approach." Sarah saw the target. Her training kicked in immediately. All the hours in the cockpit, all the calculations, all the understanding of how to get a 30mm Gatling gun to do exactly what needed doing. She was precise, she was controlled, she was everything that a soldier should be. In 3 minutes, the target was neutralized. The ground troops radioed their thanks. The mission was successful, and Sarah turned her plane toward home. Back at the base, Marcus was waiting for her as she climbed down from the cockpit. He didn't say anything at first. He just shook his head like he was amazed. "That was beautiful," he said finally. "It was a job," Sarah said. "It was more than that," Marcus said. "You got out there and showed the world what you were always capable of. That's beautiful." Over the next 6 months, Sarah flew 15 combat missions. None of them spectacular, all of them successful. She became known as a reliable pilot, the kind you wanted in the air, the kind you could trust to get the job done right. But she became something else too. She became a symbol for the young women coming up in the Air Force, for the people who'd been dismissed and doubted, for anyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong and had to fight to prove that they did. She didn't ask for that, she didn't want it, but she understood that she couldn't unring that bell. The world had decided that Sarah Chen was important. The world had decided that her story mattered. So she tried to live in a way that honored that decision. She started a mentorship program for women pilots. She gave talks at schools about following your dreams even when no one believes in you. She visited military hospitals and talked to soldiers who were rebuilding their lives after trauma. And in the fall, she went back to Redstone to visit her mother. Linda had hung the medal Sarah had been given in the living room, right on the wall where anyone visiting could see it. Sarah felt a little embarrassed about it, but her mother was proud, and there was nothing to do but accept that. They sat on the porch, watching the Oklahoma sunset turn the sky into fire. "I was thinking about something," Linda said. "You remember when you were little and you wanted to be an astronaut?" "I was 6, Sarah said. "You were 6, Linda agreed. "And I told you that if you worked hard and believed in yourself, you could do anything. And you said, even if people don't want me to. And I said, even if people don't want you to. Do you remember that?" "Not really," Sarah said, "but that sounds like something you would say." "Well, I want you to know that I meant it," Linda said. "I meant it then, and I mean it now. The fact that you flew an airplane and solved a murder and changed the Air Force, that's not despite the people who doubted you. That's because you believed in yourself when no one else did." Sarah felt something tender open in her chest. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "Yes, you could have," Linda said. You're strong enough to stand alone, but you didn't have to. I was here." In December, the A-10 community held its annual dinner. It was a formal affair: dress uniforms, speeches, recognition of pilots who'd gone above and beyond. Sarah hadn't expected to be recognized. She'd just been doing her job. But the command staff had other ideas. They presented her with the Distinguished Flying Cross. It was the kind of honor that usually went to people who'd done something heroic in combat, people who'd taken on odds and beaten them, people who'd inspired others through their bravery. Sarah's citation was different. It recognized her service in the air and on the ground. It recognized her integrity and her commitment to truth. It recognized that she'd chosen the hard right over the easy wrong, and that choice had mattered. As she stood there in her dress uniform, holding the medal, Sarah thought about David Hutchins. He was sitting in a federal prison now, serving the first year of 25. She didn't spend much time thinking about him anymore. Her anger had been processed. Her revenge had been taken. What was left was just the fact that he'd made choices, and she'd made different choices, and the world could see the difference. That was enough. Later that evening, one of the other pilots, an older man named Chuck who'd been flying A-10s for 30 years, came up to her. "I wanted to apologize," he said. "For what?" Sarah asked. "For doubting you, for thinking that you didn't belong here, for believing the gossip instead of watching your work." Sarah had heard variations of this apology for months now, men stepping forward, acknowledging they'd been wrong. She was used to accepting it with grace. "I appreciate that," she said. "But I want you to know something. It's not just me. It's everyone who's ever been doubted, everyone who's ever been told they're not good enough. We all deserve to have people believe in us before we have to prove ourselves. Don't wait until the disaster. Don't wait until someone nearly dies. Start believing now. Start looking at people who are different from you and ask yourself what you're assuming about them." Chuck nodded. He looked uncomfortable, but he was listening. "That's the real change," Sarah said. "Not that I got medals, but that the people who come after me don't have to survive a missile strike to be believed in." In January, Sarah received a package at her apartment on the base. It was from Dale. Inside was a letter and a bottle of bourbon that cost more than Sarah usually spent on anything. The letter said, "Sarah, I wanted you to have this. It's been a good year. You became everything I thought you'd be when I first picked you up on that mountain road. I've enclosed something else you might like to see, some old photographs from my time in the world. When you said you wanted to understand where I came from, I thought you might like to see it. I'm proud of you. That's something I don't say often, but I'm saying it now. You're the kind of person this world needs more of. Don't lose that. Dale." Inside the package were photographs. Dale as a young man in a military uniform, significantly younger than he'd been when Sarah met him. Dale in places that clearly weren't the United States. Dale standing next to people who looked important. Dale in moments that clearly mattered. Sarah called him that night. "Who are you?" she asked without preamble. Dale laughed. "I'm an old man who likes bourbon and good conversation." "Dale, I was a lot of things in my life," Dale said. "Some of them good, some of them not so good, but the best thing I ever did was help you. And the second best thing I ever did was watching you fly back here and fix it." "Why did you help me?" Sarah asked. "Because when I looked at you, lying on my couch bleeding and broken, I saw someone who mattered. And I'd spent enough of my life being around people who didn't matter, doing things that didn't matter. I wanted to be around something real." After they hung up, Sarah sat with the photographs for a long time. She wasn't going to ask Dale to explain his past. Everyone had a past. Everyone had things they'd done that were complicated. What mattered was what they did with the time they had left. Dale had used his time to save her life, and in doing that, he'd maybe saved his own. In the spring, Sarah was promoted to lieutenant colonel. She was made the commander of training operations for the base. The same position David Hutchins had wanted. She took it understanding the weight of it. She was going to shape the next generation of pilots. She was going to teach them what it meant to fly with integrity, to make decisions based on what was right instead of what was convenient. She thought about her first day as commander, standing in front of the training room full of new pilots, young men and women who were at the beginning of their careers. "I'm going to tell you a story," she said. "Not a war story, but a story about what it means to belong somewhere where not everyone thinks you belong." She didn't tell them it was her story. She told it like it was a story about a pilot, anonymous, specific details changed to protect the people involved. But every person in that room understood who she was talking about. This pilot, Sarah said, had a choice. She could have disappeared. She could have accepted the version of herself that others had written. But she chose to believe in herself, and that choice changed everything. She paused, looking at their faces. That's what I'm here to teach you. How to believe in yourself, how to believe in each other, how to fly not because you have something to prove, but because flying is who you are. That summer, Sarah took the A-10 up alone. No mission, no combat, just a pilot in a plane in the sky. She climbed until the earth was just a pattern of colors beneath her. She leveled out at 12,000 feet and just flew, feeling the wind under the wings, the engines rumbling beneath her, the weight of the aircraft responding to her touch. For a moment, she thought about the day it all fell apart. She thought about the missile. She thought about the crash. She thought about how easily she could have died. Then she thought about all the moments after. The survival, the investigation, the trial, the return, the acceptance. She thought about the young women she'd taught who would go on to fly combat missions, who would prove themselves, who would become pilots not despite their gender but simply as pilots. She thought about the change she'd helped create just by refusing to disappear. "Thank you," she said quietly into the microphone, though no one was listening. "Thank you for letting me come back. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for letting me fly." She turned the A-10 toward home and descended back through the sky. Behind her, the sun was setting over Oklahoma. Ahead of her, the base was lighting up for evening. The runway was clear. The tower was waiting. "Angel 7, you are cleared to land," the controller said. "Copy that," Sarah said. "Angel 7 coming home." And as she touched down on the runway, as the wheels hit solid ground, as the plane rolled to a stop on the concrete, Sarah Chen understood something fundamental. She had lived when they said she was dead. She had fought when they said she was weak. She had spoken truth when they said she should stay silent. And she was still here, still flying, still believing in tomorrow. That was the real victory, not the medals or the promotions or the people who finally admitted they'd been wrong. It was this she had chosen herself, and that choice had set her free. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Sarah looked up at the sky one more time. It was clear. It was beautiful. It was full of possibility. Tomorrow she would teach again. She would lead again. She would help shape the future. But tonight she would go home and call her mother and tell her everything was good. Everything was going to be good. Because Sarah Chen had discovered the deepest magic. That sometimes, when you refuse to stay dead, when you refuse to accept the world's version of your limitations, when you choose truth and integrity over comfort and silence. Sometimes the sky trembles, sometimes the world changes. And sometimes you get to be the one who changes it.